Today we are joined by Moeletsi Mbeki, a political economist, author, and chairman of the South African Institute of International Affairs, an independent think tank based at Wits University. Mr. Mbeki, thank you very much for making time for us today.
Thank you for having me.
There's a lot going on, but let us start with domestic governance. It has been just under a year since the ANC lost its 3-decade-long majority in the country. Why do you believe that the ANC lost a lot of its support from its traditional voters?
Why the ANC lost the support of its traditional voters? If you recall, the ANC had a wonderful slogan which it used to fight the elections. The slogan was, "A better life for all." So this was a promise of a bright future for all the people of South Africa, especially for the ones who had been discriminated against during the apartheid era. So it captured the imagination of the voters. And at one stage, the ANC got nearly 70% of the voters because of the promise it was giving to the population and to the voters. What, however, started to happen was that the ANC went back to its core membership, its core constituency. What we forget is that the ANC is a party. Primarily, it's a party of the African middle class. So once it got into power and once it entrenched itself in power and felt that it had the control of the country, it started to focus on developing the African middle class rather than developing the interests of the people of South Africa as a whole. And that is where the policies of Black economic empowerment came from. That's where preferential procurement came from. That's where employment equity came from. These are the policies that advance the interests of the African middle class, which is the core base of the ANC. So during the years, the rest of the traditional ANC voters, which were mainly the urban African working class and the rural poor, started to realize that ANC programs, far from advancing the interests for a better life for all, were actually advancing the interests of the African middle class who were employed in the public service. And their standard of living started to rocket while the economy came to a standstill. So gradually, these people stopped voting for the ANC. Some started voting for smaller parties, but on the whole, they stopped voting for the ANC. That's why eventually the ANC ended up losing the election.
And then leading on that, after the election, the ANC then formed a GNU with the Democratic Alliance and 8 other smaller parties. You have previously described the GNU as sort of like the old ANC policies or the old ANC government in drag. Could you expand a little bit on that? Yes.
Well, I call the government of national unity the ANC in drag because it has actually not changed the policies that have been favoring the African middle class to the exclusion of the rest of the population of South Africa. So what the coalition, let's start there, what the agreement, remember the President Ramaphosa had to be re-elected, and he had to be re-elected by parliament, notwithstanding that he didn't have enough votes. So the Democratic Alliance used its votes, its 22%, to add to the ANC 40%, so that President Ramaphosa could be re-elected to parliament. Deputy President Mashatile could be re-elected as deputy president of the country, and the Speaker of the National Assembly could also be re-elected. So they had to be re-elected with the support of the DA. The expectation, I think, of the country was that the DA was going to use this leverage to change the policies that the population was unhappy about, to use this leverage to change the economic policies, for example, that favor the African middle class, and bring the ANC back to policies that favor all the people of South Africa. But this has not happened. It started to happen only over the budget. For the first time, the DA started to try and use its leverage over the budget by blocking, by trying to block the budget, the increase of value added tax. But up to now, the Democratic Alliance has been moaning and groaning, but it has not changed the fundamental policies that the ANC has been pursuing, which favor the middle class to the detriment of all the other population groups in the country, and to the detriment of employment and of industry in the country. So that's why I said that up to now, the government of national unity was the ANC in drag.
So, as you were saying, that in the negotiations and the build up amongst the first year, it was sort of just getting other parties in ministerial positions, not changing any of the economic policies that were done in the previous administrations. But now there's been quite a few high-profile policy disagreements from, as you mentioned, the value-added tax. And then there's also things like Bela and Expropriation Act. And these have shown that the contention between the DA and the ANC. How do you see these contentions now playing out, especially as what we've seen with the fight over the budget?
Well, we have yet to see the decision over the value-added tax. There has been a lot of dispute. There's been a lot of toing and froing. The Minister of Finance could not deliver his budget speech on the 19th of February, and when he came back on the 6th, was it the 12th of March? When he came back with an increase in value-added tax. The Democratic Alliance opposed the portfolio committee report on the budget framework, which still included the increase on value-added tax, but it still got passed with the support of smaller parties. So up to now, the Democratic Alliance has not brought about any real change in the policies of the ANC. Well, let us see what happens in the next vote over the issue of the budget. But as of now, it has not brought about any change. As for the question of the Expropriation Act, well, that's a more difficult one because the Expropriation Bill was actually passed in the 6th Parliament. So strictly speaking, it should have been put to bed then. It's just that President Ramaphosa, for reasons known to himself, did not sign it during the life of the 6th Parliament. But that's when it should have been signed.
And now moving on to the economy and the policies that we've been discussing. You've said that South Africa's political power is highly concentrated in the hands of the middle class. How can you expand a bit of how this has happened and what risks this poses to the South African economy?
Well, yes, political power in South Africa is not only concentrated in the hands of the middle class, it's concentrated in the hands of the African middle class. The African middle class is our weakest middle class in South Africa because during the 20th century, the African middle class has been losing its assets. It accumulated assets in the 19th century. They were landowners. They built a media industry for themselves. But during the course of the 20th century, as a result of political dominance of Afrikaner nationalism from 1910, the African nationalists forced down the standard of living and the asset ownership of the African middle class. So the African middle class mobilized the rest of the population to fight against discriminatory policies. So in 1994, it emerged as a leader of the people of South Africa, and then it was elected to form the government. But the problem of having a middle class that owes no assets running a capitalist economy is very problematic, because how does this middle class survive when it has no assets in a capitalist economy? So how it survives is that it uses the tax system, because it controls political power. It uses the tax system to tax the private sector and transfers those resources to the state, and then it redistributes those resources as salaries, as highly inflated salaries, to the middle class itself that controls the state. Now, the consequence of this is that there are fewer and fewer resources for reinvesting in developing the economy and in growing the economy. So that is the problem.
Mm. And expanding on this, South Africa's economy has not shown enough growth to create employment and address deep-rooted social issues. What, in your view, continues to hold back South Africa's economy from faster and more inclusive growth?
When resources are being transferred from the private sector through the tax system, it means that the private sector does not have the surplus to reinvest in developing the economy, to reinvest in producing the economy. So in South Africa today, for example, the International Monetary Fund a few years ago, analyzing the salaries of the public sector in South Africa, found that 17% of gross domestic product in South Africa go to the salaries of the public service. Similar countries like us, like Chile, Thailand, in Asia, middle income countries, it's only 6 or 7% of GDP that goes to the to public sector salaries. So that's what political control by a middle class of a capitalist state, that's what happens, is the middle class uh, screams off the profit from the private sector, uh, and turns that into its own salaries, and then the economy cannot grow because of the removal of the surplus from the private sector to the public sector. I hope that answers your question.
Yes. And expanding on this, so South Africa's economy has not shown enough growth to create employment and address a lot of deep rooted issues. So, is cutting down the large public service wage bill among the things that are needed to reignite economic growth? What are some of the quick wins that are needed to be done, or policy changes to reignite economic growth?
Well, certainly, if we want our economy to grow, we have to cut back the cost of the public service from 17% of gross domestic product down to 6 or 7% of gross domestic product, which is what the public service is in similar middle income countries to South Africa. Now, the 10% GDP savings that we would make by doing that, if we add that, at the moment, we only have 15% of GDP in South Africa it goes into investment. But if we save 10% of GDP from public sector salaries and transfer it to investment, then all of a sudden our investment level will grow up to 25% of GDP, which will be where it was in the early 2000s. Then the economy will start to grow.
And you've been notably critical of the implementation and the policies of Black economic empowerment in South Africa. Could you please expand on why BEE may be doing more harm than good?
Well, what BEE does is it transfers resources in existing companies to a small elite within the ANC, a small political elite within the ANC. That's primarily what it does. It does not create new wealth. It does not create new entrepreneurs. What we need in South Africa is we need to create new entrepreneurs. We need the development of new entrepreneurs. As you know, the century and a half of racial discrimination in the country meant that our entrepreneurs are only coming from the white population and from the Indian population. But that's only about 10% of our population. The African population and the colored population were excluded from entrepreneurship. We now have to bring this population to become entrepreneurs, which means we have to disincentivize them from becoming civil servants. But Black economic empowerment incentivize and affirmative action and employment equity incentivizes them not to become entrepreneurs, but to become parasitic on the existing companies, and at the same time to become parasitic on the state. When what we need in our economy in South Africa, we desperately need to develop new entrepreneurs, not a parasitic class.
And related to that, you in your book Architects of Poverty, you speak about how Africa's political elites perpetuate poverty for personal gain. Could you please elaborate a little bit on this with reference to the current dynamics in South Africa? I know sometimes you've referenced it as almost carrot and stick type of ruling, but could you please elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, if you compare the elites to understand what I was saying, you have to compare the elites in South Africa today, the African elite, ruling elite, to the ruling elites in Asia. The ruling elites in Asia, they are driven, their motivation is to grow the economy. And in order to grow their economies and to uplift their population, they actually have to suppress the consumption of the capitalist class, and they have to suppress the consumption of the middle class and of the professionals. And they use the resources that they save to uplift the mass of the population through high quality education in the country, high quality health care, high quality housing care. So they uplift the standard of living and the quality of education of the mass of the population. This is why it is possible for Asia to become the factory of the world today. Countries like China have become the factories of the world because they have highly skilled population, highly educated populations. That's how they have become. The elites in Africa, the African elites in Africa, including our African elite in South Africa, they drive their own consumption, which is why we have very poorly educated population, very poorly housed population, very low health standards amongst the mass of the African population. South Africa, for example, has very high disease loads with HIV, AIDS, and all sorts of other diseases. That is what the problem that we have in Africa is, that the elites in Africa, in a way, perpetuate the semi-colonial exploitation of the mass of the population. Unlike in Asia, where the elites uplift the population, re-educate them, and then they become more productive.
And leading on my final question on that, now we've discussed quite a bit about the government of national unity and South Africa's long economic stagnation. But do you believe that a constructive government of national unity, one that effectively drives economic growth, is possible during the seventh administration? And as a two-parter, to do that, what would you consider as our quick wins or policy changes that need to happen to reignite it and to have a constructive GNU?
Well, first, if we want a quick win, we have to get rid of black economic empowerment. That will give us a quick win, in the sense that it incentivizes those who want to invest, especially foreign investors, to start to take investment in South Africa seriously. If you have to invest in South Africa today, a foreign investor has to give 25% of his equity to this black political elite. Obviously, that's a disincentive to investment. So that would be a quick win. But I don't think the DA and the others have the muscle to compel the ANC to change that policy.
Mr. Mbeki, thank you very, very much for your time and your invaluable insights. It was an incredible interview, and thank you again for making time for us.
Okay, good luck. Cheers.